African American mutual aid started pretty much on the boats when we were dragged here forcibly in chains. We were helping each other, even though on the boats we were, the captors wouldn't even let people who spoke the same language or who were from the same community be chained together.
Oh.
So, I mean, that kind of mutual aid and camaraderie is really incredible when you think about it, because you had people who weren't from the same culture, they weren't from the same religion, they didn't even have the same language, but they
still
were helping figure out how to support each other, whether it was supporting a whole group to jump overboard, whether it was supporting a group to have a resurrection, or whether just surviving the trip over here. So from then, we had this sense, I think probably from the way that African cultures had also had a sense of mutuality and communalism, and then we practiced it wherever we could. Sometimes it was a communal garden, sometimes it was the whole Underground Railroad to move people out of slavery up into freedom. Sometimes it was actually people pooling money to buy each other's freedom when those opportunities came up. And so just all the different, and actually the first really official mutual aid societies were burial societies, which again is interesting because it's about culture again, right? So enslaved people, right, you don't even own your own bodies, so you and your family can't control your burial. But it was so important how you get buried that, again, that mutual aid, they would pool resources so they could bury people the way they felt they deserved to be buried. And then that grew into all kinds of other mutual health associations, widow and orphans protection, even up to mutual insurance companies came out of that movement, and co-ops themselves. So it's just all these connections because of this notion of how do we survive, how do we work together, and how do we honor the humanity, the culture that develops the humanity that we believe in so much, even though we're in a world that's devoid of, that's trying to rob us of our culture and rob us of our humanity. Most of what I think they said, 60% of the mutual aid societies were actually started and run by black women.
Right.
So Ella Jo Baker, most people know her from the NAACP and SNCC, because in the 50s and 60s, she was like one of our icons in the civil rights movement and helped to organize SNCC. She actually was a co-founder of the SCLC with Martin Luther King, which nobody knows about because she was a woman and they only focus on Martin Luther King. But in her early years, right out of college, she lived in Harlem and had met a guy named George Schuyler, and together they started the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And that group was young blacks who were promoting cooperative economics. They said, here we are in the 1930s, and yet we're still enslaved economically.
Right.
We need to figure out how to create economic justice, and they said they felt that co-ops were the way to do that, and so they started talking to people about co-ops, training people, helping groups start. They had a 5-year plan about starting small. You just get a buying club and create a grocery store co-op, and then do a credit union, and then have a local regional association. They had, within their first year of starting, they had a conference in Pittsburgh, 600 people. In 1931, so the height of the Great Depression, 600 young black people came together to talk about co-ops. And so there was clearly this recognition that we need something new, we need alternative strategies, we need to come together to discuss them and learn about them, and then we need ways to support each other in doing it. And that's what the Young Negroes Cooperative League was trying to do, all those pieces. The things that Ella Baker learned in the co-op movement, I argue, is what made her such an icon for the civil rights movement, because in the civil rights movement she really is one of our sheroes, specifically about grassroots democratic leadership and development. And I think that notion of how to do organizing, how important grassroots organizing is, how important it's not just political civil rights but economic justice, I think we learned a lot of that from the way she organized things she said. I also tell people, name me a 20th century black civil rights leader, and I can probably show you some connection they have to the co-op movement or co-ops or something. So Dorothy Height's another one. In the 1960s, she was working with Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, and they were using this pig bank program, which actually was used in international development. And that's a way that you give women a pregnant sow. She takes care of the sow, and when the sow has babies, and they usually have 2 babies, sometimes 3, the woman gets to keep one of the babies. The other baby goes to somebody else, and the sow goes back to somebody else, who then repeats the process. And what you do then is put a pig in everybody's backyard.
Right.
And what a pig in your backyard means is that you eventually can have meat almost for a year, but also you can get that pig, if it's a female, you can impregnate that pig and have more pigs. But it's a way to give an asset.
Right.
To women, and all they have to do is agree to do the maintenance of the pregnant sow.
Right.
The whole white supremacist narrative is about how blacks can't, right? They can't make any decisions, they can't run anything, they don't know what they're doing, they have to be under white folks. So when blacks started doing this stuff and succeeding, the white folks not having it. I looked at some of the lynching data that somebody like Ida B. Wells put together, and she was one of the ones who actually said that most lynching was about economics, not about sex, right? That most of the men, most of the blacks were male business people who were making it, who were landowners or business owners. She didn't actually say co-ops, but when I started looking at the co-op history, it's the same story. So to stop them from succeeding and from being a model for other people, they would hound them, and then they used sex. Even in the co-op, some of the co-op examples, they accused the black leaders, the black male leaders, of some kind of sexual thing as a way to justify it. But they're really trying to stop the co-op. They're trying to stop independent black economic activity. And then a lot of blacks stopped talking about co-op work and stopped calling what they were doing co-ops because it was so dangerous. And so they really had to go underground. In many different periods in our history, we went underground, and I think that's part of why we don't know this history. When blacks got free, and even before emancipation, right, some blacks got free. Either they bought their freedom or they ran away or whatever. There are examples of communal towns where blacks created towns where they just own the land together and farm together. So we already have, so that was even earlier than the farm co-ops that we know of now.
Right.
So there was all those different kind of iterations of how to work together, how to own together, how to get around the fact, right, that we don't, it's hard to own land and we don't own land. The Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, which I mentioned, that was part of what they were doing by the 1880s. Their plan was, they had the credit exchanges because they wanted to make sure there was credit for fair mortgages to buy land and equipment so that you could farm. They were continuing the mutual aid, but now, you know, by the 1880s, the U.S. has laws that you can create co-ops, so they're trying to use the new laws that allow you to actually have a co-op, not just a mutual aid society, right? So they're buying land as a co-op, they're creating credit unions so they have access to credit, they're doing stores so they can buy in bulk the supplies and the food that they need. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives joined with the Land Emergency Fund and is now called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. So they also do saving black land, helping blacks to maintain land, usually through sustainable farming, but it doesn't always have to be through that. So they also do legal work, they do co-op education. The data shows that the height of black land ownership was early 1900s. By 1906 or 7, we lost 6 million acres in black land, mostly because of federal policies
right,
that didn't allow loans for blacks, and then the Great Depression. So trying to get back, you know, I think we're at 1.4 million or something. We're some very low level of black land ownership right now.
I hear about the civil rights bill for black farmers.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that?
The point of that bill is, again, to support and enable black land ownership, to take away the existing federal policies that have been in the way of that, to continue to give back some reparations for the people who lost land because of the federal policies, which either wouldn't give them lending or lent them at too high an interest rate, so they still went under. And then the other piece that they added was they also talked to a bunch of us about what would help blacks to be able to keep the land, right? And that's where, again, co-op support for co-op ownership, co-op development, co-op education. Broadly, in the 21st century, I've seen black worker co-ops, black credit unions, and black food co-ops seem to be the fastest growing of the co-op. One of my colleagues did a report on 10 cities that are supporting worker co-ops, and most of them are also cities that have high black populations. My theory is that you do need to start small and slow, because learning economic democracy, it's relearning, right? Because it's pretty much any notions of that kind of democracy are beaten out of us from early age. So we really do have to learn by doing. So do one at a time, start to do this, then we realize what other policies we need, we get more people interested, more people who see how it works or see how it changed their children's lives, get excited about it and want to support a policy. So that kind of bottom up, keep adding, learning, adding, getting more people comfortable with it, knowing more what we need. I think that's how to really do this, and luckily that seems like that's what a lot of places are doing now. They're really just trying to do something, start it, and then keep moving. So Du Bois's notion of a black co-op economy, what he said was, right, that capitalism just allows a few people to make it. Everybody else gets left behind. If we're worried about our race, our group, right, then we need a strategy like cooperative ownership, because there you have broad ownership, you don't have individual wealth, you have community wealth, broad ownership, you have everybody who has a similar experience with the economy, a similar experience of being exploited, can now take control, right? And for the benefit not just of themselves but of the whole community. So Du Bois has some beautiful language. I have a bunch of quotes of his about how, not only do we need to do this to create our own sort of economic phalanx to protect our own communities, but we can also teach the world. I have another thing where he says, we can teach the world industrial and cultural democracy, a world that clearly needs it. We can teach them industrial and cultural democracy. So he also felt like we could kind of lead the way in how to do this. Self-determination on the labor side, cooperation for the whole group, make sure it's wealth for everybody, right? If you combine those two, then you get this vision that we keep talking about, right, which is an ecosystem of cooperatives. We talked about the lessons learned, we talked about the strong role of black women, that movement from mutual aid to cooperativism. The importance of education, we probably didn't talk about it enough. I actually found that 95% of the co-ops that I learned about how they started with a study group or some kind of education program. And so I really talk about how important that is. One, it's an organizing tool, right? To get people together, get everybody in the same room, communicating, talking about what the issues are and why co-ops can be a solution, and then what is a co-op and how to do a co-op. But that learning together also creates the camaraderie and the trust that's needed to persist, to keep the co-op going. Also, co-ops really need continuous education, so that starting out with a culture and philosophy of learning together is really important, because you need to keep that going, to keep the co-op going. Even though we said, a lot of the black co-ops had to go underground to protect themselves from white supremacist terrorism, they couldn't go so underground that the community didn't know that they were there and know what they were doing, because they also needed the community. So understanding how important it is for community to know, even if they're not members of the co-op, sometimes they'll be customers, sometimes they'll give donations when the co-op needs money, sometimes they'll be political or physical defenders of the co-op. And so understanding how strong, how much you need that symbiosis with community is really another one of the lessons that stands out for me.